dark side of fairy tales for a better sleep. A scary bedtime story I'll tell you in a whisper. Subscribe and give me a like. Sweet dreams and cozy listening. Prologue. Whispers beneath the floorboards. Charlie Reade was 17 when he found the key. It wasn't hidden in a dusty attic or buried under some gnarled oak tree deep in the woods behind his house, like something out of one of those cliched adventure stories kids read when they were too young to know better. No, it was tucked beneath a loose floorboard in his closet, wrapped in a scrap of velvet, so faded it might have once been royal blue, but now looked more like the color of an old bruise. The note tied to it with fraying thread read, "For the boy who sees too much." Charlie didn't see himself as particularly special. He wasn't one for fairy tales or ghost stories. His idea of magic came from baseball bats and gloves, not dusty books or whispered legends. Yet, there was something about that key cold iron, etched with symbols that made his fingertips tingle, that felt like a whisper from another world. A world just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for him to stumble into it. And stumble he would. Chapter 1. The Dog, the Door, and the Shadows. 3 days after finding the key, Radar appeared on Charlie's porch. A German shepherd with eyes like shattered amber. He seemed to materialize out of thin air, as if summoned by some unseen force. Charlie's father, a man who had stopped speaking entirely after the death of Charlie's mother 5 years earlier, muttered only 2 words when he saw the dog. "Keep him. He's watchful." That was all the encouragement Charlie needed. Radar became his constant companion, shadowing him everywhere, even to the old well at the edge of town. The well was infamous among the townsfolk. Some called it haunted, others said it was cursed. Kids dared each other to toss pennies into its depths, listening for the faint splash that never came. But when Charlie stood over the well, holding the strange key in his hand, he felt an undeniable pull. Without thinking, he dropped the key into the darkness. The ground shuddered beneath his feet. A low groan echoed through the air, and then a door appeared in the ancient oak tree beside the well. Its surface was carved with the same symbols as the key. Empis, Radar growled, his voice deeper than any dog should be, almost human. "What?" Charlie asked, staring at the dog in disbelief. "Empis," Radar repeated, his amber eyes gleaming unnaturally bright. "Turn the key." Charlie hesitated, but only for a moment. Something inside him, a mix of fear and curiosity, compelled him forward. He reached out and turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a swirling void of twilight and shadows. And then, before Charlie could change his mind, Radar nudged him gently from behind, sending him tumbling through the doorway. Chapter 2. Empis, where the sun never rises. When Charlie opened his eyes, he was no longer standing in the quiet woods of Texas. Instead, he found himself in a place that defied logic and reason. This was Empis, a realm of perpetual twilight where the sky was bruised purple and streaked with veins of black lightning. Trees twisted upward like skeletal hands, their branches whispering secrets in languages he couldn't understand. Rivers ran thick with ash, and the air smelled of decay and burning sugar. It was beautiful in a way that made Charlie's stomach churn. Radar trotted up beside him, his form shifting slightly. In this strange land, the dog seemed larger, more imposing. His fur shimmered faintly, as though dusted with starlight. "This is Empis," Radar said, his voice fully human now, rough and gravelly like stones grinding together. "A land of broken stories." "Broken stories," Charlie echoed, still trying to process everything around him. "Yes," Radar replied. "Every tale you've ever heard, fairy tales, legends, myths, they all have roots here. But Empis has fallen. Its heart, the shining core, has been stolen by Malachar, the Sorcerer King. Without it, the realm is dying. And why does this matter to me?" Charlie demanded, his voice rising despite himself. "Because you're the talebearer," Radar said simply. "The prophecy says a boy from your world will come to restore the core and free Empis from Malachar's grip." Charlie laughed bitterly. "Yeah, right. I'm just a kid from Texas. What makes you think I can save an entire world?" "You'll see," Radar said cryptically. "But first, you need to understand what you're up against." Chapter 3: The Warped Realities of Empis. As Charlie and Radar journeyed deeper into Empis, the truth of the realm began to reveal itself. This was not the land of happily ever after that most people imagined when they thought of fairy tales. Here, the stories were warped, twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. In one village, they encountered Hansel and Gretel, or rather, what remained of them. The witch's candy-coated oven still stood, but instead of baking sweets, it roasted children alive. Hansel and Gretel had grown old and bitter, their faces lined with grief and guilt. They warned Charlie to turn back, claiming that anyone who tried to fight Malachar would end up just like them, trapped forever in a nightmare of their own making. Further along, they met snow-white dwarfs. These weren't the cheerful miners from the storybooks. They dug not for gems, but for memories, extracting fragments of happiness and hope from the earth to sell to the highest bidder. When Charlie asked them about the princess herself, they merely shook their heads and pointed toward a distant mountain crowned with thorns. Sleeping Beauty awaited them there. Or rather, her curse did. She hadn't slept for centuries. Instead, she wandered endlessly through a labyrinth of briars, her body decaying while her mind remained painfully awake. Her screams echoed across the mountainside, a haunting reminder of what happened when a story went wrong. "The dark side of fairy tales for a better sleep," Charlie murmured, reading a tattered banner hanging outside a crumbling inn. It was a nursery rhyme here, a lullaby mothers sang to terrified children. Radar growled softly. "Malachar twists these tales to poison minds. He steals endings, happy ones, sad ones, and leaves nothing but static. People stop caring. They sleep through the end." Charlie clenched his fists. "So we wake them up." Chapter 4. The Castle of Echoes. Their journey led them to the Castle of Echoes, Malachar's stronghold. It loomed on the horizon, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. As they approached, Charlie could feel the weight of stolen stories pressing down on him. Each step brought new visions. Cinderella's prince lying dead at midnight, Red Riding Hood's wolf devouring her grandmother, the little mermaid dissolving into foam as her prince married another. Inside the castle, every surface was covered in mirrors. Most were cracked or shattered, reflecting distorted versions of reality. Malachar himself stood atop a staircase made of broken glass, his skeletal frame draped in rotting velvet. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light as he regarded Charlie and Radar. "So the talebearer has arrived," Malachar sneered. "You think you can undo what I've wrought? You think you can fix this?" With a wave of his hand, Malachar conjured an image of Charlie's father, drunk, weeping, drowning in his own despair. Another flick of his wrist showed Charlie's childhood home, empty and lifeless. "All stories end," Malachar hissed, "even yours." But Charlie refused to falter. He clutched the key tightly, feeling its warmth spread through his palm. "Not today," he said, stepping forward. Chapter 5. The Shattering. The battle that followed was chaotic and surreal. Malachar hurled shards of mirror at Charlie, each one containing a stolen ending. One showed a car crash, another a funeral, yet another a lonely man staring into a bottle. But Charlie fought back, using the key to deflect the attacks. With each strike, the mirrors shattered further, releasing the trapped stories within. Finally, Charlie reached Malachar and plunged the key into his chest. The Sorcerer King screamed as the shining core ripped free, its light searing the walls of the castle. Empis trembled as the stolen stories returned to their rightful places. Trees straightened, skies cleared, rivers flowed clean again. But as the dust settled, Charlie realized something was missing. "Radar," he called, spinning around. But the dog was gone. Chapter 6. The Weight of Stories. Back in Texas, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such an ordeal. Charlie buried the key beneath the floorboard again, but the scent of velvet lingered, a reminder that the door to Empis was never truly closed. His father started talking again, though sparingly. The town seemed quieter, less burdened somehow, but Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left part of himself behind in Empis. At night, he dreamed of Radar's growl carried on the wind, of Sleeping Beauty's endless screams, of the Castle of Echoes collapsing in on itself. He began to write, not just about his experience in Empis, but about the stories he'd seen twisted there. He wrote about the witch who roasted children, the dwarfs who mined memories, the princess who couldn't escape her briar maze. And as he wrote, he realized something. The dark side of fairy tales wasn't just a fantasy. It was a reflection of the real world, where stories mattered because they shaped how people saw themselves and each other. Sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was listen. Chapter 7. The Legacy of Empis. Years passed. Charlie grew older, wiser, and perhaps a little sadder. He became a writer, penning novels that explored the darker corners of human nature. Critics called his work unflinching explorations of trauma and redemption, but readers simply called them real. One day, while signing copies of his latest novel at a bookstore, a young boy approached him. The boy clutched a tattered copy of The Dark Side of Fairy Tales for a better sleep, its cover worn from countless readings. "Is it true?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "Did you really go to Empis?" Charlie smiled faintly. "Does it matter?" The boy frowned, confused. "What matters," Charlie said, leaning closer, "is whether you believe it. Because sometimes believing in something, even if it's scary, is the only way to make sense of the world." As the boy walked away, clutching his book tighter, Charlie glanced out the window. For a moment, he thought he saw a pair of amber eyes glowing in the twilight. Then they were gone. Chapter 8. The Fragility of Peace. Life in Charlie's hometown of Larkspur, Texas, seemed quieter after his return from Empis. The streets were still lined with pecan trees. The sunsets still painted the horizon in hues of gold and crimson, and the townsfolk still gathered at the diner for coffee and gossip. But Charlie knew better than to trust appearances. Beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. His father, though he'd started speaking again, was withdrawn. He spent hours sitting on the porch, staring into the distance, as if searching for something or someone he'd lost long ago. Charlie tried to talk to him, but the conversations always ended the same way, with silence. At school, things were worse. The kids who had once teased Charlie for being weird now treated him differently, not out of respect, but out of fear. Word had spread about the strange events surrounding the old well. Some claimed they'd seen lights in the woods at night. Others whispered about a ghost dog with glowing eyes. Charlie tried to ignore them, but the whispers followed him everywhere. They clawed at the edges of his mind, gnawing at his sanity. He began to question whether he'd truly saved Empis, or if he'd only delayed the inevitable. Chapter 9. The Return. One evening, as Charlie lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from his closet. His heart raced as he sat up, straining to listen. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the closet. His hands trembled as he reached for the handle. The door swung open, revealing the loose floorboard. The velvet-wrapped key was gone. In its place was a note. Written in jagged, uneven letters, it read, "The door is open. Come back." Charlie's breath caught in his throat. He knew what he had to do. Chapter 10. The Second Descent. The second time Charlie stepped through the door to Empis, it felt different. The air was heavier, charged with an electric tension that made his skin prickle. The landscape had changed, too. The The once twisted trees now stood upright, their branches reaching skyward like supplicants. The rivers ran clear, but their waters shimmered with an unnatural light, as though infused with something otherworldly. Radar was waiting for him on the other side. His form was larger now, more wolf-like than dog-like, his amber eyes glowing brighter than ever. "You shouldn't have come back," Radar growled, his voice deeper, more resonant. "I didn't have a choice," Charlie replied. "What's happening here?" "The balance is shifting," Radar said. "Malachar isn't gone. He's fractured, scattered across Empis. Each fragment feeds on the stories of those who remain. If you don't stop him, he'll consume everything." Charlie's stomach churned. "How do I stop him?" "You must find the fragments and destroy them," Radar said. "But beware, each fragment holds a piece of his power and a piece of your own fears." Chapter 11. The Fragments of Fear. The first fragment was hidden in the ruins of the witch's cottage. The air smelled of burnt sugar and charred wood, and the ground was littered with the bones of children. Charlie's heart pounded as he stepped inside, the walls closing in around him. The fragment took the form of his mother. She stood in the center of the room, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. "Charlie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you save me?" Charlie froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Mom, you let me die," she continued, her voice growing colder, harsher. "You stood there and did nothing." "No," Charlie said, shaking his head. "That's not true." "It is true," she hissed, her form shifting, twisting into something monstrous. "You failed me. You fail everyone." Charlie clenched his fists, forcing himself to look away. "You're not real." The creature lunged at him, but Charlie raised the key, its light driving the fragment back. It screamed as it dissolved into nothingness. Chapter 12. The Final Fragment. The last fragment was hidden in the Castle of Echoes. Malachar's presence was stronger here, his laughter echoing through the halls like the tolling of a funeral bell. Charlie faced the final fragment alone. It took the form of his father, drunk and broken, his eyes filled with shame. "I'm sorry," his father said, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't protect you. I couldn't even protect myself." Charlie's heart ached, but he forced himself to stay strong. "You're not him," he said, raising the key. The fragment shifted, becoming Malachar himself. "You'll never escape me," the Sorcerer King hissed. But Charlie didn't hesitate. He plunged the key into the fragment, and the castle collapsed around him. Epilogue: The Boy Who Listened. When Charlie returned to Texas, the key was gone. The door beneath the floorboard had vanished, leaving only smooth wood behind. But Charlie knew better than to think it was over. On quiet nights, he swore he could hear Radar's growl carried on the wind. And when he opened his closet, the floorboard still carried the faint scent of velvet. He understood now that even happy endings had teeth, that the dark side of fairy tales wasn't just a fantasy. It was a reflection of the real world. where stories mattered because they shaped how people saw themselves and each other. And sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was listen.